Hello again, everyone, and welcome to your first sample question on the topic of residency requirements. So this question is going to test your knowledge on one of the easier aspects of residency requirements, and that is the time requirement, as we talked about in the lesson. All right, so here is your question. Now, your question has Mr. Shea. So Shea is a Canadian permanent resident who originally came to Canada in February 2011 as a federal skilled worker and worked for the Montreal Hockey Corporation until February 2012. In September 2015, Shea was surprised to have received a notice that he was in violation of his residency requirements, and that this would mean a loss of permanent resident status. Upon receiving this notice, he immediately returned to Canada and filed for an appeal. Unfortunately, the appeals process was lengthy, and Shea calls PK, an RCIC, on September 15th, 2017, because it has now been 2 years that he has been awaiting his hearing before the IAD, and he'd like to know how this affects his appeal since he's been in Canada the whole time. What is PK likely to advise? Now we're left with our 4 options here. So we have A, Shea's appeal will be dismissed because he has now met his residency requirements by being in Canada for 2 years out of the last 5. B, the officer made a mistake because Shea had until February 2016 to return to Canada and could then complete his residency requirements. We have C, Shea's time in Canada from September 2015 does not count towards his residency requirements. And we have D, due to the fact that Shea has been in Canada for 2 years since September 2015, he has met his residency requirements until September 2022. Okay, so you have a lot of options here, and in your mind, remember from the lesson that we just did that you want to think of the time on here on sort of a sliding scale, and that will lead you towards the correct answer. So as always, if you want to press pause right now and figure out the answer to the question, that would be recommended. And if maybe you knew the answer right away, which would be amazing, then we'll continue on. So let's begin by exploring B as the option that we'll take a look at. So B says that the officer made a mistake because Shea had until February 2016 to return to Canada and could then complete his residency requirements. All right, so you could probably tell that we need to really pay attention to the dates, and using that method that we discussed before, as seeing everything sort of on a sliding scale, that will help simplify your process in answering this question. So this is what you should be doing in your head, is thinking of a timeline for Shea. Now we have all these years over here. We'll go through this really step by step. Now from the story, if you remember, they mentioned that he was a permanent resident who came to Canada to activate his permanent residency in February 2011 and stayed until February 2012. They mentioned that he lived in Montreal, or that he worked for the Montreal Hockey Corporation, so you can assume he lived in Montreal. Remember that living in Quebec does not play a role in whether or not someone has met their residency requirements. So somebody can live in Quebec. It's not a problem at all. It would still count towards their residency requirements. All right, so our timeline should form something like this to begin with. So we have 2 as the second month in 2011 until 2012. Which represents 1 year that Shea was in Canada. Now this gives us another hint, because if you take a look at the end of the timeline here, we can tell that this will be our first 5-year period, because Shay arrived in Canada and activated his permanent residency in February 2011. So our first time period would be ending in February 2016. So remember that this, of course, is due to Article 28, where the permanent resident must meet those residency requirements every 5-year period. Okay, let's jump ahead to take a look at the next element of the story as it deals with the time that we're looking at here. Okay, so we know that in September 2015, he returned to Canada because he received that notice and he filed for an appeal at that point. Now this gives us another hint with regard to the time period, and this tells us that he was out of Canada for about 3.5 years. So from February 2012 till September 2015. Now the final piece that we need to understand from the scenario here is this last one. So he's been in Canada now for 2 years, and it's September 15th, 2017. So he's been in Canada for 2 years awaiting his IAD hearing. All right, so from this, and this took us 4 minutes right now to really analyze, but once you get used to going through this process, it'll take you way, way, way less time. All right, so we know that Shay only spent 1 year in Canada. That counts towards his residency requirements, and that was that first year that he spent. Okay, so remember that in this option over here, we're taking a look at the timeline for him. So we know that from February 2011 to February 2016, Shay had to have 2 years of residency that would go towards his residency requirement, but he didn't. So the officer did not make a mistake in this case. Shay could not return in February 2016, for example, and then do another year, because he would still have only 1 year of residency for that 5-year period from February 2011 to February 2016. So we know that B is not the correct answer. Let's take a look at D now. All right, and now because we did all of that hard work in analyzing B as the answer, as not being the answer, when we take a look at D, life is a little bit easier. So we have that timeline in our head still. And with this one here, we can see that D says, due to the fact that Shay has been in Canada for 2 years, since September 2015, he's met his residency requirements until September 2022. All right, so this answer is very, very, very wrong, and there are so many reasons why this is wrong. You can probably think of a few already. One is that, as we saw before, Shay didn't meet his residency requirements before. So it's not something that someone can attempt again and again and again. It's pretty much game over at that point. The other one, of course, is because even if he met his residency requirements from 2015 to 2017, which he didn't, as we'll see later on, it wouldn't be until 2022. That would be until 2020. So it's very impossible, really, for D to be the correct answer. All right, so now we're only left with 2 options, and if you've been working through the simulations and you've been working through the videos, you probably know that this is sort of what you should be expecting in the exam. You most likely have two options that are pretty incorrect, as we just saw, and two options that are correct or leading towards being correct. Now let's work through both of these final options to see if you got the correct answer. Alright, so now we're only left with two options. Now we have A. So A says that Shay's appeal will be dismissed because he has now met his residency requirements by being in Canada for 2 years out of the last 5. And we have C. Shay's time in Canada from September 2015 does not count towards his residency requirements. Alright, so with C, remember that of course they don't mean just September 2015, they mean from September 2015 on. Now we know from working on this timeline that we have this as representative of Shay's time in Canada and under what conditions. Now the trick to understanding this one, of course, and which one is correct, so which one, if it's A or C, deals with this one over here with Regulation 62. So remember that time spent in Canada after an inadmissibility report is issued would not count towards residency requirements. Now for Shay, he's already lost his, well, he's in the process of losing his PR status anyways because he definitely did not meet the residency requirements from February 2011 to February 2016. Remember that he only spent the 1 year in Canada at that point. So at that point, like we saw in analyzing D, at that point it's really game over. Even if he's in Canada awaiting trial, awaiting his IAD hearing, and he's there for 2 years out of 5, it still doesn't negate the fact that he didn't stay in Canada for the 2 years out of 5 from before. Okay, and just by understanding Regulation 62, we know that the time that he spent in Canada after being issued that Article 44 report does not count towards residency requirements anyways. And that leads us towards C as being the correct answer. So remember that this question dealt with residency requirements as it pertains to time. You're going to have to prepare yourself for some tricky questions like this, even though this one, I don't think this one was as tricky as some of the other ones that we're going to give you. But it's important to start thinking of time in relation to that grid. So start thinking of time in sort of a sliding scale, and you'll be able to answer these ones a lot faster. Okay, as always, a big thank you for tuning in. I know all the work that you're doing in preparing for the exam. Keep up the good work. You've mastered time as it relates to those residency requirements. So keep up the good work in that. And in the next question, we're going to deal with another aspect as it relates to this very important topic.